to the Talent Optimization Podcast, the go-to podcast for CEOs and HR professionals wanting to bridge the gap between the strategy and tactical implementation of talent optimization within their organizations. Through interviews, predictive index, and personal experience, your host, Tracy Shirk, helps you discover the facets of talent optimization from both a CEO and HR perspective to truly create the dream team for your organization. Are you ready? Let's get started.
Welcome to the Talent Optimization Podcast. My name is Tracy Shirk, and I'm the Chief Talent Officer here at Elevated Talent Consulting. I am curious, how many of you have talent pathway plans inside of your organization? And within those talent pathway plans, you've actually developed some feedback to your staff to ensure that they know exactly what they need to do to move to the next step or next position that may be on the horizon for them. If that is you, or if it's not, and you just want to know, hey, how do we give really good feedback? Because that is what we're going to chat about today. I want to introduce you to today's guest, Harrison Kim.
Hey, Tracy, how are you?
I'm great. And you?
I am good. Can't complain.
Good deal. So Harrison is with us from PaveStep, and PaveStep is a performance management tool that really makes giving feedback simple and tracks that. So Harrison, I'm super curious. Tell me a little bit about why feedback is important.
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, feedback is important for a variety of reasons, but for us, it comes down to a few things. One, development. Feedback is one of the most effective ways and efficient ways to develop your people, right? Especially when it's got that right ingredient set of it's specific, it's behavior-based, it's real-time, or as real-time as possible, right? And I'm sure we're going to talk a little bit about what makes feedback effective or constructive, if you will. But when it's done right, it can be very powerful for development. That's number one. Second is it allows managers and leaders and employees to clarify expectations, right? If you just set a goal or if you set some kind of a task or project and don't provide any frequent feedback or updates in between, then you're likely going to find some misalignment, right? And the easiest way to clarify that is through these interactions, communications, and feedback. Third, I would think about motivation. I mean, most employees crave feedback frequently and recognition, frequently, right? This is especially true with ambitious high performers. They're very, very focused on growth, and they know that feedback is one of the best ways to grow, when they receive it in real time. And I would say lastly, feedback is important because it's critical, to your performance management process, which of course ties into how you make decisions about your people in most organizations.
Awesome. Thank you for that list. That's amazing. And it absolutely goes into what all those reasons are. Now, I have a question that we have not yet rehearsed. So, whenever I find somebody that's incredibly passionate about something, there's typically a backstory, and we don't often talk about that backstory. So why is feedback this thing that you kind of latched onto and created this system around?
Yeah, so I started my career as a consultant at McKinsey. McKinsey is one of the large kind of consulting firms globally. And one of their biggest rituals and part of their culture is sharing and receiving feedback. Like literally when, I was working there just right out of college, right? I was receiving and sharing feedback with everyone within my team, on a weekly or bi-weekly basis. This is one of their biggest aspects of their culture. So, for instance, when you get onto a project, one of the first things your manager will ask you is, how do you like your feedback and when do you want it typically, right? And you really set processes and these kind of language, right, around, hey, how do you actually do feedback within your team? When do you do it? How do you not do it? All of these things. And I absolutely loved it, right? When you have that kind of real constructive feedback in real time and you're not afraid to receive it, you're not afraid to ask for it, you're not afraid to give it. It's something that I really took away from that experience. And that's probably really the original inspiration point, if you will, of PaveStep. And then after that, I was in a private equity firm called Odyssey Investment Partners, where I actually specialize in the human capital management market. And, this, of course, because of my specialization kind of came up as an industry that I was looking into. And I thought, hey, I think there's something here and this is something that I'm passionate about. This is something that I can provide some insight on. And that's how PaveStep got started.
Awesome. So one of those things that we look at is what are the best practices to feedback? And so often when we talk about best practices to feedback, we're talking about how to give it, but you just mentioned something really important, and that was how to receive it. So I'm curious, what are some of those best practices?
Yeah, I think from a receiving perspective, I think that's actually harder and more important than giving feedback, to be honest. There's a few things. One, if I were to talk about like mindset for a second, I think it's important for the receiver to really assume or really incorporate like radical candor, if you will, into their mindset when they're receiving feedback. So some of your folks that are listening to the podcast here may be familiar with radical candor.
I love that book, by the way, and I like wrapped it into a lot of our training programs. So yes.
yeah, perfect. So I'm not gonna kind of repeat the whole thing, but at the simplest level, it basically means you can be direct and nice. In fact, you should be direct and kind, right? If you care about somebody, you should be more direct with them instead of like hiding behind white lies and things like that, right? And for me, I think it's really critical that when I'm receiving feedback, when anyone's receiving feedback, they presume, hey, this person is giving me feedback because they care about me, right? It's not they're trying to like put me down or give me a gotcha, right? They're trying to give me this feedback so that I can develop better and be a better professional or whatever the situation is, right? So that's first thing is the mindset around radical candor, right? Second thing I would say is don't be afraid to ask for time. No matter how much practice you have with feedback, there are going to be times where you're faced with some, corrective feedback where you're like, hey, like, the flight, fight, or freeze kind of a thing is kicking into my brain, right? And I can't respond very well. In that case, like, don't be afraid to be like, hey, I really appreciate your time and attention here, but can we come back to this in a few hours? Like, I want to have a productive conversation, but right now I'm not in a good place, right? I think that's like a very fair and mature thing as somebody who's receiving feedback, right? And then the last thing I'll mention is, and this goes both for sharing and receiving feedback, but I would try to make it much more of a regular thing between, a manager and an employee, both upward and downward, because I think one of the worst things and worst mistakes that people can make is only giving feedback when it's negative or corrective in nature, right? Whereas if you make it much more regular and you mix in both positive and negative, right, it just becomes part of your workflow and part of your standard operating procedure, rather than this like unexpected event that you're scared of, when your manager or somebody says, hey, can I give you some feedback? So that would be some of the things that I would think about from a receiving perspective.
I love it. I love it. So, when we talk about the giving perspective, right? Like we can give feedback in a way, like we never make anyone feel anything. However, the way we do it does have an impact on how they feel, right?
Yeah.
So there are times where we give feedback and it just feels crappy. There's time where we give feedback and it feels good, even if it's a hard to hear piece, right? So I'm curious, like what's behind that?
Yeah, I think there's a lot of stuff that you can unpack here. I think one of the biggest things for me personally anyway is around like the relationship, actually. So it's between the sender and the receiver of feedback. Like, do you have a trusting relationship with this person, right? Like, does this person know/think that you actually care about this person, right? And really, again, the whole thing we talked about just now regarding like radical candor, right? Like you're doing someone a disservice if you're not being direct with that person. So like, has that been kind of established? And also at the same time, like, does this person feel like we're on the same team? Like, am I really giving you feedback where it's like, hey, like this is something that we need to figure out together, right? I think that's number one, is that kind of relationship aspect. There's a few other things that I think about, like around the context of the feedback. Like, is it good? Is it bad? Is it like, what about timing even, right? Like sometimes it's, you have a conversation, when this person is especially having like a horrible day, for example. Okay, maybe you shouldn't do that, right? Like, or you give like a negative piece of feedback or corrective piece of feedback, like over the weekend. Like, okay, nobody probably wants that, right? So
Right.
Timing is something to think about. And then the last thing, which I think kind of is a little off tangent from your question, but the last thing I'll think about is around like the culture itself of the organization or the team, hopefully the organization is like, how is feedback actually perceived in the organization, right? Is it something that is a gift? Have the leaders and managers like really acted on it, shown that it's a real gift, right? And has the organization set policies and values around sharing and accepting feedback, right? All of these things matter when it comes to like people feeling quote unquote crappy, right? So yeah, I mean, aside from the whole like, hey, here's how you do it, but even if you do it correctly, like you could still feel great or not so great coming out of that conversation. I think these are the kind of the relationship, the context, and the culture are the things that you can kind of start thinking about, in that particular situation.
Absolutely. And culture is so incredibly important, especially when we look at, what are your organizational values? What are those cultural values? Because all culture is behaviors that are accepted or not accepted, right?
Absolutely.
So when we look at that and look at feedback as a part of the culture and it's blended all the way in, you talked about McKinsey. The first question is, how do you want to receive feedback? This is our culture. So get on the bus or get off it, right?
Mm-hmm.
So with that being said, that culture goes a long way into what is happening there. And so, how do you, blend it and make it a part of that?
Yeah, that's I think $1 million question that I think is really easier said than done. But like we do have a framework around like culture, like change management and things like that around changing people's behavior. But one of the biggest drivers of making, feedback or really anything into a part of your culture is like role modeling / kind of sponsorship from the leadership team, right? The leaders have to walk the talk. Like, tactically speaking, nobody's going to listen to your policies or your speech if you don't practice them yourself, right? That's just kind of the easy truth. And by the way, they got to like walk the talk visibly, right? You can't just do it behind the scenes and hope that everybody notices. You've got to like kind of make a show out of it to make sure that everybody understands like, hey, I'm doing this because this is important for us and this is how you do it, right? And the second thing I would think about in terms of it's more specific to feedback is education. A lot of people often don't share feedback because they simply don't know how, or because they don't think that the other person knows how to receive it, right? So the education component is pretty critical, where you need to create kind of like an explicit agreement around like, hey, this is how we do feedback, right? Like norms around like, this is how we do feedback. This is how you should do it. This is how you should not do it, within hopefully at least, the two individuals who are sharing and receiving feedback, hopefully at the organizational level, right? That's the ideal situation. But at least at the two people level, I think that's something that education and getting on the same page, that's really important as well.
Awesome. So my last question for you, right? So before we end with our normal ending here, but what's one interesting insight relating to feedback and culture that you've noticed in your work?
Yeah, so I think this is something that internally that we talk about as like unforeseen consequences. So over the last several years, as in many countries and many organizations, D&I has become a very focal point, right? Mm-hmm. A very big focal point. And I think there's an interesting, almost like unfortunate, unforeseen consequence of focusing on D&I on feedback culture. So I have heard of, these organizations who have a very strong D&I agenda, strong initiatives around it and policies around it. And certain individuals, in the leadership or manager roles don't feel uncomfortable giving feedback to people of color, people in the minority, right? Because they're like, I don't want to be branded as racist. Right. I mean, as simple as that, right? I mean,
yeah. So I want to pause here for a second, because we're saying DE&I, and I just want to name diversity, equity, and inclusion. So for some of you out there that are going, I didn't catch that. I don't want you caught in trying to figure out what DE&I is. I want you really listening to what Harrison's saying, because there's some gold here. Okay, so go ahead.
Yeah, no, I appreciate that. And yeah, so that's something it's obviously a very difficult topic, right? And it's going to be very difficult to even uncover whether this exists within your organization or not, right? Through convention methods, like asking people, like you're not going to be, not many people are going to be, telling you this information, right? I've really learned this from through very personal connections and personal conversations that are private. And it's just something that I think leaders need to just be mindful of, right? I frankly don't know exactly what the silver bullet answer is, and I'm sure it depends on the organization and the situation on a case-by-case basis. But when this happens, it actually creates a massive gap, right? Because one of the reasons why DE&I initiatives exist is because you want to have diverse leadership, not only throughout the organization, but at the leadership level as well. But if your existing leaders are only choosing to provide a set of feedback because they feel comfortable with these individuals that look like them, right? Just to be very simple about that, right? Like very direct about that, then you are actually, kind of creating this reinforcement mechanism where the people who don't look like you are getting less development, getting less motivation, getting less care, and therefore very much less likely to get promoted into those leadership positions. And it's not just, I don't think it's just, hey, like Caucasians are doing this with Caucasians and nothing else. I don't think that's the case. I think it's everything, right? It's like you could be an Asian male, you could be an Asian female, you could be a black male, you could be a black female, you could be a white male. It doesn't matter. Like I think people have more comfort around that, typically speaking, with the people that they're more comfortable with, especially in this context of like strong DNI initiatives. So they're like, ooh, like you see these blind spots basically.
Right. And what's underneath this, right, is fear. We have
Exactly.
a fear, and I'm saying we as a global we, not, but just in general. But I think that there's definitely a fear around, if I say this, then this is going to come back, and this goes back at the very beginning of our conversation, Harrison, you talked about mindset and the importance of trust within feedback. And both of those things are going to go hand in hand in that conversation, right? Yeah. So what is, the mindset that we have around it, and where is the trust built, right? The trust is built when we get to know individuals and not as Asian, African-American, 42 years old, 67 years old, right? Yeah. We get to know them when I can say, hey, Harrison, like, I know you just had this crazy thing happen and you're moving to Canada and all these things are happening. Now I'm getting to know you, right? And so that feedback piece, I love what you added there, because there's such a huge gap within that. And, so as we kind of go to land the plane here on our podcast today, I love this question of thinking about, do we give feedback differently based on who's in the room? And what is that around? Is that around the color of their skin? Because that's not cool. Or is that around the trust that's being built in the fact that there's a lack of? Or what exactly is that? And how do you start to change the conversation, especially if we go back to the very beginning, which is feedback is a gift? If feedback is a gift, why would we not want to give that gift? And why would we not want to receive it?
Yeah. And it's interesting. I think one thing that you could also do, like kind of like tactically and like mathematically almost, is, assuming you have this data available, and if you don't, you should still be able to kind of get some, higher level data from your performance management systems. Like look at how people rate each other and look at how often people share feedback with one another. Look at even people's calendars and how much time they're spending with one another or one another, like a person of minority, right? People of color. Even things like how long is it taking for you to respond to a feedback request from Jane versus Jack versus Harrison, right?
Right.
It's funny because, these are at enough sample size, these can be very telling stats, right? So,
for sure.
And like one way to kind of think about like identifying a potential problem.
Yeah. Absolutely. And I think the first step there is, hey, do we have, and I will name that I'm like a recovering queen of avoidance. Okay. So with that being said, right, like, do we know how to give feedback, and are we giving it, period? And now let's start looking at all these different items versus just jumping to that, because we got to get our base building blocks in place first.
Yep. Absolutely.
Awesome. So what's a takeaway you have for our executives listening in today?
I mean, if you care about like culture and like people development, any of these things that we talk about on this podcast and just overall broadly on your podcast, or frankly, kind of anything else, role modeling is literally one of the biggest drivers of change. Yeah. Like you've got to walk the talk, right? I'm sure, in your previous lives, when you were not a leader, I'm sure you've seen leaders who just provide you with lip service. And I'm sure you were like, oh, that's just lip service. Like, don't be that person.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, for sure. Or the meeting after the meeting, right? And so what is a takeaway that you have for our HR professionals listening in today?
Yeah, I guess when it comes to feedback and kind of related to more culture and performance side, and I don't think this is any kind of, groundbreaking knowledge, but if you have somebody within the organization who is an influencer, who is a more of like an operations or, quote unquote, business unit leader or manager within the organization who cares about people and culture, like loudly, hang on to that person as a sponsor and pull that person in all the time. Because I think that person will be one of your biggest change makers, if you will, or ambassadors.
Absolutely. Well, Harrison, thank you so much for the conversation today. And Harrison and I are doing a webinar together, so we'll be sending that out through all the LinkedIn, all the fun things there. So be sure to join us to dig into this a little bit deeper with some very specific, how-tos. Harrison gave a number of those, but we'll go a bit deeper into that and how to operationalize some of this. I don't know, we maybe even do some role playing on it to sometimes it's easier to see it in action, right? So with that, all of Harrison's information and the information on PaveStep and what they are doing as a company to really kind of take feedback and put it into the mainstream of what you're doing inside your organization will be in our show notes. So with that, thank you so much for joining us. We cannot wait to see you next week and have a great week.
Thank you, Tracy.
Thank you for joining us on this episode of the Talent Optimization Podcast. You'll find more tools and resources for CEOs and HR professionals looking to bridge the strategies versus implementation gap of talent optimization at elevatedtalentconsulting.com. We've also created a free, valuable resource for you to begin bridging the gap called the Talent Optimization Foundation Membership Program. You can access it for free at elevatedtalentconsulting.com/foundation. Be sure to tune in next week for another episode to learn more about talent optimization and creating a dream team for your organization.